the owner of Greg Rubin is the owner of one of the largest native landscape contractors in the state, California's own native landscape design in Escondido. Greg followed an unusual path to become a landscape contractor. This area has been hit by major firestorms in recent years, yet the homes surrounded by landscapes his company had installed did not burn. Greg's years of experience as an aerospace engineer enabled him to understand the thermodynamics of fire in the landscape and to develop a landscape design technique that provides beauty, greenery, and a degree of fire resistance. He'll share how he emulates and takes advantage of natural ecological processes to create a successful native landscape. Greg is also the co-author with Lucy Warren of 2 best-selling books from Timber Press, The California Native Landscape and The Drought-Defying California Landscape. He has made frequent appearances in television and radio, as well as written articles for or has been featured in numerous publications. In 2018, he was chosen by the Horticulturist of the Year by the San Diego Horticulture Society. So without further ado, Greg Rubin.
Thank you, Christine. So great to be here, guys. Thanks for inviting me. And I've had this fire talk going for several years, but I keep tweaking it and adding things and changing pictures and stuff, and often coming up with new insights and revelations, and I try to incorporate those as we go too. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and start the okay. I guess bear with me, guys. I'm going to open it up in another window here. And we're having some technical issues earlier. I think we've got them ironed out, but I kind of lost my the program, the PowerPoint that I wanted to run, so I'm reloading it. Bear with me. Okay, and can everybody see that okay? All right, got a thumbs up, so let's get started. Sorry for the delay. And so, yeah, I call this one Fire-Resistant Native Landscape is not an oxymoron. There's so many bad conceptions about native plants and fire, and, you know, like they're gonna spontaneously burst into flame and burn down your house, but that's not what happens at all. And we've had a real good track record. So we're going to talk about, you know, how to set up native landscapes so they can resist fire and hopefully create defensible space around your house. As Christine mentioned, I used to be an aerospace engineer. We've done a lot of landscapes in Southern California, been involved in some pretty high profile work. And we have the 2 books out there, which 2013 and then 2016. And Lucy and I are working on a 3rd book on maintaining California native landscapes, because there's not a lot of information out there, unfortunately. Just a little background, most of the plants that we use in our native landscapes come from, you know, our Mediterranean plant communities, which are mostly coastal, chaparral, coastal sage-grouse, woodland, and fire is a part of their ecology, but it's very misunderstood. One of the issues we run into is that there's so many threats to native plant communities, like land abuse. I mean, you might think you're looking at, I don't know, oak savanna, but actually what you're looking at is cow pasture with a few oak trees in it. This has been destroyed, type converted, changed, and all that's left pretty much are the oak trees. Another way that our natural lands are getting abused is through quote unquote fuel reduction. And they have a lot of carbon credit money to spend, so agencies are going in the middle of nowhere and doing this. There's a lot of rare manzanitas once on this hillside, and they're pretty much mostly gone. And of course, you know, when you do this kind of disturbance, it is not without cost, because you tend to turn it into something like this. And when you turn it into something like this, not only have you lost all the habitat value, not only have you lost all the natural humidity associated with these plant communities and turn it into a virtual desert, but now you've increased the fire situation, the fire frequency, to a much more dangerous outcome. And these flashy fuels can all go up simultaneously, and you get increased erosion. It's just a nightmare. And this is what we're turning California into, the so-called Golden State. None of that grass is native. I mean, to call this an ecosystem preserve is, well, that is an oxymoron, because there is no ecosystem left here. In fact, it's nothing but weeds. And there's so much erosion, you can actually see the erosion rills in the upper left corner up on that slope there. It's just Armageddon is what it is. There's no habitat value left in this. And one of the big misconceptions is that chaparral needs to burn, you know, and I tell people, and I get this, Rick Halsey and I are pretty close compatriots, and he's often said that chaparral needs to burn like your house needs to burn because you have fire insurance. So in fact, you can actually very effectively eliminate chaparral by just burning it too frequently. And here's a classic sort of serendipitous photo illustrating that, showing the condition of chaparral that burned in 1970, then burned again in 2001, and then for another time in 2003 in the Cedar Fire, or Harris Fire, I think. And so you see that there's absolutely nothing left. So it cannot take as much burning as we're throwing at it. And you typically start out with something like this and very soon end up with something like this. The fact is that chaparral is dense, it is fairly impenetrable, and it is prone to huge, intense, infrequent fires. That's the natural condition, okay? It's not the fault of conservation. It's not so-called fire suppression policy, especially when it comes to chaparral. I'm not talking about, you know, pine forest. There's some arguments that can be made that there's a little different fire regime there. Chaparral is very, very different. And, you know, if you guys want to discuss that, we can. So the natural fire frequency for most experts was somewhere between 30 and 130 years. Because frankly, if you burn it more frequently than that, you lose that ecosystem. And I just illustrated what we intend to turn it into is non-native cow pasture, grassland, and weeds. So what are your natural ignition sources, right? Well, lightning. How about lightning? Did anybody say lightning? Well, actually, I thought of another ignition source. How about volcanoes? Okay. But how often do you have lightning storms during Santa Ana wind events? Okay. And these are wind-driven, not fuel-driven fires. All right. Not too frequent. In fact, it'd be a rare confluence of events that would allow for a fire to maybe ignite during a thunderstorm and then dwell around long enough for a Santa Ana to develop weeks later, and you know, you're off to the races. And people like to bring up about indigenous folks burning, but when you look at it from an evolutionary time scale, all right, humans have been around here for maybe 15,000 years, maybe a little more. But chaparral evolved over millions of years, okay, prior to human existence on the planet. And so that ecology was in place long before any humans showed up. So it's really not a strong argument. So it turns out that the vast majority of fire events are caused by humans. In fact, John Keeley, who I know very well, is one of the premier fire ecologists in all the world, did a study and discovered that between the years 1919 and 2016, for every Southern California county, 97 to 100% of all the fires were caused by human activity. Okay, that's a significant number. All right. So what are some of your common human ignition sources? Well, there's no shortage of them. Certainly arson. You've got a lot of sick people running around who are getting their jollies by lighting fires. Power lines, electrical fires. We saw that in 2007 with the power lines. Also the Paradise Fire in Northern California was caused by the power company, arcing and igniting surrounding vegetation. Smoking, I mean, hopefully that's becoming less prevalent. You know, it used to be quite common. Sparking landscape equipment. This is huge, you guys. This photo here was from a fire about 3 weeks ago, less than a mile from my office. And it's obvious how it started. Okay, it looks like they were just able to get that flail mower, lawn mower out of the flames. Okay, but clearly that's how it started, and this happens all the time. And I tell people, if you're going to be, and what's actually really ironic is that it's typically happening while they're doing fire mitigation. Okay, so they're out there mowing down all this non-native weedy grass. Okay, and obviously the blade must have hit a rock or something and caused a spark. And as compared to chaparral, this stuff is so ignitable, it's so flashy. I mean, acres go up simultaneously with these flashy fields. They're so dangerous and they're so fast moving. Okay, and they can be ignited by a spark. And I tell people, if you're gonna be out doing this kind of work, have a pressurized hose or at least a few 5-gallon buckets of water with you so you can put out the flames quickly and react and stop this from turning into a conflagration. Happens all the time. People burning trash. You know, the Pumashaw fire in Mount Palomar was started by somebody who decided to burn their trash in the middle of a Santa Ana. Cars, this is pretty common. Maybe you've seen these failing catalytic converters. They're actually spitting out, you know, molten chunks of the media, and you'll see these fires igniting along the roadside every maybe quarter mile or something, very regular going as you go along there. And so yes, this is a very common cause. Can look like arson, but in fact, it's just a bad catalytic converter, or just a car fire too, when they pull over and then they light the hillside on fire. And believe it or not, there's still kids out there playing with fire. That's what started the 2014 fires in North County. Was a, I don't know, 13-year-old girl running around lighting fires. So let's get into how we deal with this situation. Most of our strategies are based on fuel management zones within about 100 feet of the house. And it's actually a pretty successful approach. I'm going to kind of go through some different aspects of that. So the newest one is this so-called Zone 0. Zone 0 is usually within 5 feet of the house, okay? Then Zone 1 or Zone A is usually the next 30 to 50 feet. And then Zone 2 or Zone B is usually 50 to 70 feet beyond that, or even more. I mean, there's a lot of insurance companies that are requiring major clearing, and clearing is bad news. We'll talk about in a minute. But anyway, so this first 5 feet, this new zone, is basically the space under the eaves, you know, running out about 5 feet. And in general, they're not recommending any plantings. They're playing with this concept a little bit because we think there might be some succulents or some small native perennials in that aren't going to develop enough fuel volume or flame height to really pose a problem. But in general, right now, we're creating it as a fuel-free apron, if you will, like this cement sidewalk surrounding this house that helps save this house. And we'll talk about this particular case study as we move on through the presentation. This was actually one of the first times we did this. This was back about 2001, maybe, that we tried doing this little apron around the house. And it's only about 3 or 4 feet wide, but it was as wide as the eaves of the house. And it certainly worked. This house survived the 2003 cedar fire, despite being completely surrounded by lightly irrigated native plants. What I would have done differently in this case nowadays is I just would have extended that gravel apron all the way to the DG path there. I wouldn't have done this funky little section with the mulch in there. But notice the mulch is very highly consolidated. It's less than 1 inch thick now. And that has consequences for fire resistance too, and we'll talk about that. And just to give you an idea of how we're doing things now, this was just a couple of weeks ago out in near Harbison Canyon. Okay, so this house is in the midst of just gorgeous chaparral. There is Ceanothus cyaneus growing on her property, on her slopes. Okay. There's Bahiopsis all over the place. All right. It's an amazing place. It's kind of between like Crest and Harbison Canyon. It's way out in the boonies there. And you can see in the background, you can see those beautiful chaparral covered slopes. So fire resistance is paramount. And that's what that apron, it's about a 5-foot gravel apron going all the way around the base of the house, except where we have like a cement patio here. So beyond that zone 0 apron, we go into zone 1 or A, and it along with zone 0 are the most critical to creating defensible space. And in general, it's that 30 to 50 foot zone. And we often do a lot of hardscape. This house actually survived the fire just fine, no problem, didn't even get singed. Obviously, architecture of the house is very important. One of the most important factors have nothing to do with landscaping. In fact, it's about home hardening, okay? And, you know, you get into, you know, tile roofs, plugging up the end of the tiles, removing soffit vents, going to roof vents that are screened over, double pane windows, metal frames on those double pane windows, and a lot of, you know, inorganic type hardscape flat work, gravel, that kind of thing, really helps create a lot of defensible space. And usually it's not like this huge massive flame front coming through. It's usually spot fires that are ahead of the main flames that are igniting in front of them. And those can result from flying embers or very sadly burning animals. People, I hate to be so graphic, but it's really a reality. And when you're out in it, it's pretty disturbing, but it happens. These fires, these frequent fires, you know, people don't think about what it's doing to our habitat and what it's doing to our animals out there. It's god awful. And you have a screaming rabbit running around, running under a pile of wood. You know, it's really disturbing. Wooden fences. Wooden fences can really carry a lot of flame and burn hot and bright and fast. And I'm not so much worried about wooden perimeter fences. It's more where the fences abut the garage, you know, where the wood fence and the gate are on the side of the house. Much better to use stucco and maybe metal gates in this area instead of wood fence and wood gates coming in from the outer perimeter fence into the garage, where just wick those flames in and light up the eaves and the rafters, and you're off to the races. So that's one area of improvement that we can make to make it more defensible. And also, don't pile up wood against the house, debris against the house, okay? Your firewood against the house. Just move it away, move it out from under the eaves. You know, you'd be amazed like how many of the houses in Scripps in 2003 burned, not because of the eucalyptus trees everywhere. They hardly got singed. The fire moved through so fast. No, it was a combination of shake roofs and debris around the houses. Also in this zone 1, this first zone, that's a great place to do, you know, permanently irrigated plantings. And if you want something for a more drought-tolerant native lawn substitute, Carex progressilis is wonderful. This is a native field sedge, and it's beautiful. I actually went back in this La Jolla installation, hoping to get this beautiful, you know, this photo of this beautiful manicured hedge lawn, but they liked the way it looked naturally, just this beautiful hummocky meadow, and they decided just to keep it the way it was. And you can, though, mow it, okay? And you can play on it. And when you mow it, it even smells like a newly mown lawn, but you're watering it half as much as a typical sod. So there's lots of native lawn substitutes. We've had excellent luck with using the Carex progressilis. All right, so beyond that first zone, zone 1 or A, we have zone 2 or B. Typically starting at 30 to 50 feet, extending to 100 feet from the house, 150 feet or more. A lot of places, if you're on a slope, they're looking for a horizontal displacement of 150 feet, which means the slope itself over the ground, you could be 200 feet or more. You know, John Keeley did a study, and the results of that research, and this is scientific research, and they looked at a tremendous number of actual burns, you know, Rancho Bernardo area, Poway, that anything over, I think the number was 68 feet, and you get quite diminishing returns. Okay, it's not even 100 feet from the house, but this is where we're at right now with the current thinking, and we need to deal with it. And I'll show you what we responsibly do in those areas, okay? And there's a couple different scenarios. You might have native vegetation growing in that zone, which needs to be managed. Or in fact, it may already be cleared and open, and you're going to do some plantings for a lot of reasons, hopefully natives, and we'll talk about both scenarios. So site hygiene is what it's all about, okay? It's critical. Basically, site hygiene is about trimming dead matter off the plants, pruning up plants, also getting rid of the weeds, the non-native grasses, mustards. These things tend to degrade the native plant community, making it generally more susceptible to fire, and also act as dry ladder fields. And so you really want to get on, this is an example in Ramona. This property has survived a lot of burns, as have the 40 mature Engelmann oaks on the property. And by cleaning the property, you can see how the oaks responded. These Engelmann oak trees, these rare Engelmann oak trees, went into full bright yellow bloom. Those are flowers all over it. And that's what happens when you take weeds out of ecosystems, guys. It's beneficial all the way around. That's what the site looked like before we cleaned it up, okay? I mean, the only thing native in this photo is that oak tree in the background there. But it was all mustard, it was all fillery, it was oat grass. It was a mess. And believe me, this is the kind of flashy fuels that go up instantaneously, the whole area. And a lot of this has to do with disturbance and prior fires, okay? It just sort of is self-perpetuating. But when we came in and cleaned this all out, all these native plants that had been suppressed suddenly appeared, including Perry's delphinium, Asclepias californicum, the beautiful red-flowered milkweeds, ribes, white flowering currants. It was incredible just by getting the weeds out of there. And of course, in this particular case, those 40 mature Engelmann oak trees going into full bright yellow bloom. And of course, if you have bright yellow flowers, that means you have acorns, which means you have more oak trees or squirrels. Here's what happens when you have, this is the cedar fire, and this was a xylococcus, a mission manzanita. This client was doing her site hygiene, and clearly the mission manzanita came through it beautifully. Covered in green supple leaves, you wouldn't even know that a fire came through there in this healthy mission manzanita, except the dead knotwood burned out and left a hole. But all that was burning was the duff layer here. There were no weeds. And with that good hydration, because of its good health and the lack of competing weeds, you end up with a very low flame height and a lot of native vegetation that survives the fire. So again, as you're managing this native vegetation, the fire ladder concept is really important. Basically, if we have trees of some height, we like to prune them up 3 times whatever the understory height is. So basically, if your buckwheats and that are 18 inches tall, you want a gap of 3 times that, which is 4.5 feet, which means you're pruning to the base of the branches about 6 feet. 4.5 plus 18 inches, 1.5 feet is 6 feet. This is a real important concept here, okay? Because if the fire gets up into the crown of these trees, then you've got a real cataclysm. So you want to prevent that from happening. In most of our fires, there was that separation, just like you saw in that Mission Manzanita, and you had very low flame heights. And not only did it not burn the shrubs, it saved them, and it didn't turn into really catastrophic fire situation. Thinning, guys. So we hate this term clear, okay? Clear should be stricken from the vocabulary when it comes to fuel modification. Hell, I don't even like to call it fuel. I like to call it native vegetation. And modifying it, we remove somewhere between 40 and 50% of the coverage, okay? We thin it out, we prune stuff up, we eliminate dead wood, dead branches. You end up with something that kind of looks like this, okay? We also typically grind up that chaparral because it's the best mulch there is and put it right back down on the site, because when you open it up like this, you tend to encourage weeds, and then the weeds start this whole degradation process and ladder fuels and more frequent fires. In addition, by removing about 40 to 50% of the canopy, you're actually taking out about 70% of the fuel volume, okay, which then gets mulched up. And then you can really start to have some fun, because you can basically carve out a mature native landscape from impenetrable chaparral. And we do this quite frequently. And you put in paths and sitting areas, maybe a bird bath, a little bridge over the swale in this case. It's beautiful. It's mature. You can plant some little penstemons and, you know, colorful native perennials along the pathways. And it's just a marvel. Something that we treat as fuel is a living thing, and it supports wildlife and would cost you $150,000 per acre to try to recreate on your own. Why bulldoze it all and make the problem worse, okay? There are options, folks. There are options. It just takes education. Here, look at this. That's what that thinning looks like. That's about 40 to 50% thinning. You end up with a park. And I will tell you, the fire marshals saw this and they loved it. They said, this is what we want. This is the model, okay? This gentleman who's doing the maintenance for these folks, our client, is out in East County and just has a real instinct for what to do and doesn't overdo it. And it's beautiful. It's park-like. You can walk right through it. They put the mulch right back down on the ground. That's what we're looking for, guys. We don't have to in fact, bulldozing this is the worst thing you can do because you just end up with a weedy cow pasture full of erosion, you know, no habitat value, desertified, dry, hot. It's just, oh my God, we're so screwed up, guys. Now let's talk about, let's say we have it, somebody's already bulldozed it, for instance. I have a client I even spoke to today that they've really cleared a lot, you know, following the typical prescriptions, but unfortunately you can actually over clear. So we're gonna plant some of these places back, some of these really open weedy areas, which are also a nightmare to try to maintain once it comes back in grasses. And so part of that equation is light permanent irrigation. And something along the lines of the MP rotators, the MP 1000s, 2000, 3000, 3500s that'll throw 35 feet. Okay, these things put out less water than a drip system, okay? And it's applying it like rainfall, meaning that it dusts off the leaves, cuts down on transpiration, cools down the plants, soaks the mulch, which also consolidates down the mulch so that it's poorly oxygenated, okay, and does a little wetting of the soil, but we're not after soaking the soil, okay? It's a native ecology. What we're more after doing is cutting down on transpiration, and that mulch is a wonderful safety valve for regulating how much moisture is accessible to the plants and how much humidity there is, and what that mycorrhizal fungi has as a reservoir to deal with. Okay, so we're finding that the overhead irrigation is really important for a lot of reasons, especially on slopes where the deposition rate is very slow. And we're putting down about 0.2 inches of equivalent rainfall each time we water, and we might do that 2 or 3 times a month, which means you're putting down less than an inch per month of supplemental irrigation, and a single thunderstorm could dump an inch easy on your native chaparral. So we're less than that. We're well within the tolerance limits of the plant, plants. And we're even experimenting with this light hydration on natural plants. And far from having a real negative impact on the ecosystem, you end up with some really beautiful, hydrated, less fire-prone green plants that are not overgrowing, that are not ultimately stressing. They're doing fine. They just think a thunderstorm came through there, okay? We had thunderstorms. We dumped 7 inches of rainfall in 1 week in 2014. And it was like, henny penny, the sky is falling. Oh my God, the chaparral is going to stop dying. Well, folks, the chaparral never looked so good. That's 7 inches that dumped in 1 week in the middle of July, okay, was more supplemental water than these landscapes get from in our active watering period from May, June to September, October, okay? Far more in 1 week. So, I mean, the wives' tales out there, they're just so pervasive. We're just working hard to try to correct the perceptions and stop maligning our native plants and appreciating them and seeing just how fantastic they are in these situations. Also in these landscape areas, like in this case, this house here in Ramona, we put a 12-foot wide road all the way around the house. And they were kind of horrified by this initially, but later grew to love their country lane. But this really creates a defensible perimeter. Now, the site was so clean, they probably wouldn't have to do it, but if they needed to, they could definitely get in there, have access for their equipment, and light backfires along the outside perimeter as needed. And so it ringed the whole house, went all the way around the house, all the way around this way, came back around. And within that zone, then we have lightly irrigated native plantings like this Backward's Pigeon Point. Then surrounding zone 1, there was a stone wall. Within that, lots of flagstones, some conventional plantings, a couple of native sycamores that were watered. And then we also put about an 8-foot apron all the way around the house, okay, to keep the fire from licking up underneath the eaves. We were kind of creating a zone 0 back in 1998 when we did this landscape. And I will tell you, notice the plantings are well spaced, low growing, they're hydrated. All right, looks pretty. Okay, it's a beautiful landscape, lots of rocks and a little dry stream. Okay, well, this house has now survived 4 wildland fires. Okay, 4. I also want to point out that, notice that the roof is metallic. Okay, so the embers don't have a place to get caught and reach critical mass. If you were so inclined to plant something on a couple of these posts here, you could actually use wild grape. Wild grape is turning out to be wonderfully fire resistant, and I'll show you pictures in a little bit. So, we've had all this experience. We've had, 20 or so homes go through major fire events, knock wood without losing a home. The US Navy heard about our success. Some of the reps had actually attended a couple of my presentations, and they approached us about applying science to what we were observing and repeatedly, because they knew that most of the approaches were anecdotal and not based on experimental design, were often highly destructive to the environment, often with inconsistent outcomes. Okay, and I mean, what you're looking at is what typical firefighters see in a firestorm. Okay, it's like the fire falls of Yosemite going sideways at 80 miles an hour, in bone dry winds, and houses burn because of ember attack, an accumulation of embers, not usually from just a single ember blowing in. It usually takes a buildup of embers in crevices and vents and things like that. So they awarded us a research grant, and it was called the Ecologically Sustainable Fire Risk Reduction Study, ESFRR. I was principal investigator along with Dr. John Keeley, who I mentioned is one of the world's foremost fire ecologists. He's got hundreds of papers published out there. And he designed this study with the basic goals of developing a science-based fuel management strategy that was ecologically sustainable and supported natural habitat, that was lower water and maintenance requirement, aesthetically pleasing. And then we took the data that we collected over a period of about 4 years and entered it into fuel and fire tools, modeling software, very sophisticated, because people are kind of loath to have you actually lighting their properties on fire. We had to use the next best thing, but it's actually quite accurate and quite powerful. So we developed a selection criteria, and that had to be homes that were located at the wildland urban interface and had survived a major fire event. And they included a lightly irrigated landscape, a lightly irrigated planted native landscape, native chaparral that was thinned to common prescriptions, i.e. 40 to 50% thinning, and also had control areas that were unmodified shrubland vegetation chaparral. Okay, that was our control. And we set up weather stations on all these sites. We set up soil moisture meters. Our primary data, along with the environmental factors that got plugged into the software, were also relative fuel moisture. So we would collect samples, leaves, from all the same species in each of these different regimes, weigh them, dry them, weigh them again, so we knew what the actual moisture content was. And when we plugged it into this modeling software, these were the typical of the results. And what's graphed here in this first graph is rate of fire spread in meters per minute. And this one here is for Eriogonum and chaparral in general as a function of slope and as a function of increasing wind speed. And the dotted line is the irrigated planted natives. The dashed line is the thinned natural chaparral. And then the solid line is the unmodified chaparral, okay? And every case, the irrigated plantings, the landscapes that we installed, the native landscapes, showed the best rate of fire spread, the slowest rate of fire spread, followed not too far behind by the thin vegetation, and in both cases, always better than the unmodified controls. And that relationship existed despite, changing slope, despite changing plant community or plant types, and despite wind speed, which is significant. The irrigated always did the best, then the thin vegetation, and then the control always had the highest rate of fire spread. So these were actual definitive results and actually exceeded John's expectations. He was actually pleasantly surprised by how solid the data was. So the bottom line was the rate of fire spread was lowest for irrigated native plantings, followed by thin plantings, and that's as opposed to untreated controlled vegetation. This relationship was apparent regardless of slope angle and wind speed. Native plants maintain much higher live fuel moisture content than traditional plants on less water. And if you're predominantly evergreen natives, they even exhibited the highest levels of fuel moisture content. Evergreens being manzanitas, ceanothus, toyon, wild cherry, and they really hold on to their moisture as opposed to maybe dormant sages and artemisia. The lower growing natives exhibit even better fire behavior simply by profile. And of course, you get all those other great benefits we're familiar with native plants, including natural habitat, erosion control, low water use, ease of maintenance, and visual appeal. So one of the important points in all of this, guys, it's about hydration. Hydration, hydration, hydration. Hydration takes precedence over plant lists. Here's an example, just an unscientific burn test we did with a variety of native plants that had been exposed to about 1/4 inch of equivalent precipitation a week earlier. And there's ceanothus, there's sugar bush there. Hell, we couldn't even get the sage to light up and hold flame. I've even done experiments with ground cover forms of chamise and can't get it to hold flame if it's lightly hydrated. Got so frustrated, just threw everything together, all our test samples, and tried to light that up. We couldn't get that to light up. But what happens when you add dead, dry, dormant, flashy fuels to the mix? Whoosh, okay? And these are your fire ladders, all right? When they're lighting their backfires with their oil cans, they're not lighting chaparral. Chaparral is actually pretty difficult to ignite by itself. They're actually igniting the weeds and grasses that are usually growing next to them, okay? And there's a corollary that natives require much less water to hydrate than non-natives. I mean, we've shown that with our study. So there's basic types of plantings for fire resistant slopes. You know, there's nothing at all, which is usually a bad option for a lot of reasons. We could go with ice plant, which is very common and almost as bad as nothing at all. We can use drought tolerant non-natives and succulents, which a lot of people use with some success. And of course, what we're about, using natives in these situations. And all of them have their advantages and their disadvantages. So we'll start with ice plant. What are some of the advantages? Well, it's cheap and it's readily available. And it fills in pretty quickly. It's green. Some of the disadvantages are that it's really crappy erosion control. Guys, it's barely or non-mycorrhizal, which means it doesn't have the stabilizing soil fungi, okay? And it's heavy to boot, so it just loves to pull down unstable slopes. It really needs a fair amount of water to maintain hydration, especially to avoid forming that thatch underneath. It's highly invasive. We've seen that all along the coastline. And it forms these thatches that burn like crazy, okay? And when they burn like crazy, they boil off their water, and then just whatever's left behind finally burns. Red apple, guys, does the same thing. Red apple loves to burn. There's scenes of it burning beautiful concentric circles in the 2014 fires in Carlsbad, for instance. And ice plant is just boring to downright ugly, and it has virtually no habitat value unless you're a snail or a slug or a rat. Now we can look at, you know, drought tolerant non-natives and succulents. You see these used a lot because, frankly, a lot of people are scared of natives. They think they're going to burn down the house, or they think that they're just going to die. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we may touch on, but some of the advantages of these plants is they're definitely colorful and beautiful, and there's a lot of availability. So a lot of times the availability on these guys is better than our own California natives. The disadvantages, they need about, and this is somewhat observational, but in our experience, they need about twice the water of non-natives to maintain the same fuel moisture content. Okay, and I've got a picture to show you on this. They're certainly much better slope stabilizers than ice plant, but they're not nearly as good as California natives. And they're definitely higher maintenance because these typically require much more deadheading, especially if you use predominantly evergreen natives. And they don't have quite the wildlife value. They have some, you know, hummers love this, and there's a lot of birds, but, you know, it's nowhere near giving them the plants that they actually evolved with. And then, of course, we have natives, right? Certainly much less water required to achieve that same level of fire resistance. That mycorrhizal fungal soil biology is wonderfully soil stabilizing. You don't see landslides in the chaparral. The evergreen natives, which are about 70–75% of our plantings, typically require virtually no maintenance. No fertilizer or soil amendments are required. In fact, you can really screw up a planting by fertilizing or amending the soil. Certainly the best bird and butterfly habitat, and they lend us a regional identity. We're so busy turning Southern California into South Florida, we're forgetting what it looked like. And when you hit about 70% canopy coverage, you actually have a natural weed resistance. The disadvantages are not as many suppliers. They really don't appreciate typical ornamental horticulture and drip irrigation, although I will say that the Netafim systems are much better than the single point emitters. But for a lot of reasons, we still prefer overhead irrigation, unless we're working in a really narrow planter and there's just, you know, no way, not practical to put overhead in there. So, mulch. This is the one area that brings me so much grief. And Northern California is going hog wild on banning this stuff. We've used shredded redwood bark for 25 years. We've had lots of instances of actual fires that have gone through. And we know pretty much what its real fire behavior is in a consolidated condition on a native landscape, okay? And by consolidate, I mean that overhead watering naturally does this pretty quickly, and you go from 3 to 4 inches thick down to about 1 inch thick. And at that point, it's very dense, almost like carpeting, and so it's poorly oxygenated. And we're seeing a flame height of about 2 inches or so, okay? In the meantime, it's provided a tremendous amount of hydration sustenance for the whole native plantings. It's provided a lot of biochemistry that fosters the development of all these natural microbial processes like mycorrhizal fungi. One of the other things that people ask is, what about oak leaf litter? Should I leave it in place or should I rake it out? Well, the answer is leave it in place. Yes, it can burn. Yes, it can burn even with, 18 inches of flame height. But you're much better off with healthy oak trees that have no weeds under them that act as fire ladders that would tend to result in an oak tree that is dehydrated and thus more flammable. You're much better to leave the oak litter in place. You could take out and maybe thin it, but you want to leave at least 4 to 6 inches minimum around those oak trees. And you need to control the weeds. The weeds, as I showed in the Engelmann oak example, just completely knock out the ecology, And so I get criticized sometimes by people that say, Rubin, you sold me a sea of mulch with little green tufts. Well, I assure them that this stuff grows quite rapidly. And in fact, here's the same landscape 14 months later. All right. And I actually added a list of the plants that we have growing in here. Again, it's not about plant selection as much as it is about hydration. But people ask me, well, what actual natives do you have growing in there? Okay. And so that is an example. Okay. The John Dorley mounding manzanita with tremendous color, the Bacchus pigeon point that's a foot by 8 to 12 feet across, the Yankee point that we're all mostly familiar with that can grow 20 feet across if you let it. Bush poppy, look how happy and healthy it is. Monkey flowers, white sage, calamity sage. Calamity Jane is a really cool sage. It's a mounding sort of ground cover sage. It's a mix between purple sage and low growing purple sage and black sage that popped up at Las Politas Nursery years ago. And it's actually a really cool ground cover. And of course, Pozo Blue, which is a Cleveland sage, purple sage hybrid. It's huge and it's happy and healthy and easy and beautiful and fragrant. So yeah, 14 months later, and look at that mulch. You see the mulch is really consolidated down. It's only about 1 inch thick and it's smooth. It's like carpeting. That's where we want to get it and get it to, and that's happened really rapidly. So, okay, proofs in the pudding, right? So let's just talk about some case histories here. I think this is in Poway. Look at that guy. This is from Rick Halsey's book, Fire, Chaparral, and Survival in Southern California, and it's a fantastic book. I believe this guy did survive, but you don't want to be in this situation. And believe me, if you're on your roof watering it down and the flames are right there, it's probably a little too late. And certainly shake roofs don't help the equation at all. So I know of no other native landscape contractors that have had anywhere near as many landscapes and fires. I might be wrong, but I haven't met them yet. So we had like one on the Pumashaw fire, which is Mount Palomar. We had 2 in the Pines fire that was in Julian, started by a helicopter hitting power lines. The Cedar fire, which you all remember in 2003, we had 7 properties. 1 was Santa Isabel, 3 in Ramona, 3 in Poway. The Old Witch Creek, which came around in 2007, we had 6 properties. They had 3 in Ramona, 3 in Rancho Bernardo. The Harris fire, which was down there in the Harbison Canyon area, I had two fires, two properties. We had a property in Hidden Meadows, which was interesting. It was at the top of a 1,500-foot slope, and there were some kids playing with fireworks at the bottom of the slope, lit the whole thing on fire, and it stopped at the edge of our landscape. And we love getting those phone calls. Even had a fire marshal for the city of Encinitas who ran actual burn tests in the gorilla hair when we did the Lux Art Institute installation. That was pretty traumatic when they shut it down, but it turned out to be very helpful because he called me a couple of days later and he says, Rubin, what kind of fire retardant are you putting in this mulch? I said, no, it's actually redwood. It's actually naturally fire resistant. So he said he couldn't get the flame to sustain in there. Go ahead, finish the project. Here's a customer's yard in the cedar fire. All these plants are singed, but they're all alive. They all came back to life by that winter. Notice that the mulch is burned, but partially burned. Some areas it's not burned. I also want you to notice these plastic marker flags that marked new plantings prior to the fire. This is a very telling picture. Now, the mistake I made here, which I no longer do, is run mulch right up to the house. Now I have that zone 0, and I usually put something inorganic. But be it as it may, it actually was somewhat serendipitous because it gave us a data point. It showed us scorch marks because you could actually see how high the flame height was with this consolidated, poorly oxygenated mulch, this dreaded redwood mulch, not all of which even burned, and it certainly didn't develop enough flame height to melt the Home Depot plastic marker flags that were placed before the fire, okay? There's one flag on the lower right that is partially melted, and that was due to the garden hose catching on fire, okay? Kind of ironic. But yeah, about 2-inch flame heights. And no flags. Here's the back of the house. Okay, you see all that hardscape there? Again, under the eaves now, that would be all inorganic. I wouldn't have much of anything planted there. Notice that there are large areas of mulch that did not burn, and notice that all the flags, those plastic flags, are intact, okay? I mean, you couldn't have designed a better experiment. Now, that does not mean that this house did not almost burn. This homeowner was ahead of her time. She had double paned windows with metal frames. Now the vinyl frame windows, those frames soften, melt, and the glass just falls into the house, and here come the flames, and you're done. Tile roof, boxed in eaves, screen vents. She had everything done, and this is back in 2003. But if you look where that wagon is over on the left, far left there, the husband actually had a cord of firewood stacked against the house. The homeowner, the lady of the house, and him got into a huge, huge fight. Thank God she won and convinced him to move that cord of firewood away from the house, which he promptly placed next to the propane gas tank. However, the propane gas tank did not explode because it had a wastegate on there that allowed the pressure to burn off or fire off. But the reason that this wonderfully prepared house almost burned was at the back door there on the right, because she had wicker furniture there. And fortunately, a neighbor who had actually resisted the evacuation order saw that this wicker furniture at her back door was on fire. And it was 7 feet of flames. And she went and got CAL FIRE to come around and extinguish the flames. They broke down the door, busted out the drywall on the other side to allow it to cool better, and saved her house, okay? And this house was seriously in the middle of the cedar fire. Okay, this was the view out her back door, okay? So we had this repeated experience over and over again with our landscapes. This is in the Witch Creek fire in Ramona and Rangeland area. Remember what I said about wild grape? Well, there you go. look at that. You wouldn't even know that fire came through there, except for that incinerated Ficus benjamina in the pot next to the garage door there. But I also want you to notice that the overhead, the shade structure, is not wood. It is masonry and it is steel. And this stuff was all lightly hydrated, and large portions of the backyard had large areas of decomposed granite. And I think that all combined to really save this house, even though all of the neighbors surrounding this house burned to the ground, unfortunately. And here's something, a little lesson in relative fire resistance. The black smudge on the left is ground cover, what's left of ground cover rosemary. And the shrub on the right is a flat top buckwheat that blew in on the wind. The slope was getting watered about twice a month. And unfortunately, that wasn't enough to sustain, keep the, the buckwheat from burning, but keep the rosemary from burning, but the buckwheat is still covered with green leaves, okay? And it's sort of a classic example of a level of hydration being significant enough to sustain the buckwheat, but not the Mediterranean plant. That probably would have required about once a week watering to maintain that level of fire resistance. Same thing here. Now, again, I've got plantings close to the home, which is a no-no, but at least they were hydrated, and there isn't even any soot marks on the white stucco, okay? So again, I wouldn't do it this way nowadays, but again, somewhat serendipitous. You can see the examples. And here's that apron. And the significance of this is this fire was so hot that it actually burned the lawn. The grass, that lawn was right there to the right of the boulder, and it actually burned. And if you look up on the hillside in the background, you see a streak of molten metal that was once a water tank. So you can get an idea just how hot this fire was. What this house had going for it was a concrete apron and a metal overhead structure. And, the flames couldn't get up underneath the eaves. So did very well, This is yet another one in that rangeland development got hit hard. This is north of the airport, kind of northwest of the airport, up in Ramona. And here we had a hydrated native planting. All these plants are still alive, they're just singed. There was some mulch down. But notice we had these PGP, the Hunter rotaries. Notice it didn't develop enough flame to burn down this wooden deck, which we didn't install. I definitely would not usually install a big wood deck like that. But be it as it may, there was some ember activity. There were some little burns in some of the decking, but the house was saved. And just to give you an idea about the recovery of this landscape, here's the same landscape 3 years later, okay? So all those plants are hydrated and beautiful and doing just fine. And that's very typical of a native slope planting, and most of it's evergreen. But other homes in that same development are gone, right? And they cleared hundreds of feet, all right? Didn't save their houses. And this guy right here down the street cleared about 300 feet around his house. And he committed extreme and ecological destruction and cleared everything to bare ground, yet the house is a little pile of rubble surrounded by green palm trees and some lawn. And when I saw this, it immediately occurred to me, just coming from an aerodynamic background as an old aerospace engineer, that my God, if you cleared a bare ground all the way around your house, like most insurance companies and fire departments used to want you to do, what you do is you basically take away any chance for breaking up those flows of hot, dry, ember-laden air. And Rick Halsey put it this way, he said, you create the perfect bowling alley for embers. And the only thing that's gonna stop that flow of embers is your house, okay? And aerodynamically, if you've got hydrated shrubs in place, well, now you create turbulence and the flows start to break up. And you also have hydrated ember catchers to actually catch and cool embers on the way in there. So what we're finding was that actually the worst thing you can do is clear to bare ground. And over again, we saw this scenario play out. Even with these hydrated palm trees around, it just ignored them and just burned down the house, okay? So yeah. Same thing here, green lawn even, cleared. You can tell they cleared it because there's no ash here, okay? They just cleared these areas, destroyed this beautiful chaparral, and what did it get them? Here in the Harris fire, the fire actually went around the native landscape. It didn't ignite anything inside, even though it was a conflagration, even though it burned down the tower on top of Lawson Peak there. There was a famous video of that happening that was taken during the fire, okay? Surrounded by, you know, unhydrated natural vegetation. Well, it burned, but the landscape didn't. And the landscape was lightly hydrated, and it saved his house. It saved his $100,000 solar array, and it doesn't get much starker than this, okay? Let's just finish up here by talking a little bit about erosion control post-fire. Some people are presented with the situation where they might have a gully behind their house, a natural drainage swell. The one thing you don't want to do is seed after a fire. Seeding after a fire is one of the worst practices you can possibly do when everything is vulnerable. It's seared open and it's like a giant gash, a wound. There's carbon everywhere. And yet you are having to control some flows, right? So what we recommend is that you get T-posts and pound them in across the gully, maybe every 20 feet or so, depending on the pitch. And then you take those branches and you weave them in between, okay? And you leave spaces to allow water to come through, but slow down and catch debris. These are called debris dams. And this is a real solid way to control these flows. You can do a little sandbagging around the house and kind of direct the flows of water. And that's all you have to do, okay? This is an example of a very old photo from the 80s of a fire up on Cuesta Grade in San Luis Obispo that was aerial seeded. You can see the stripes of grass, okay? To this day, you can go up Cuesta Grade and you still see these stripes because the chaparral never recovered. In one fell swoop, it was completely type converted, and now you have these bands of grass 40 years later, 35 years later, okay? It's really destructive. It's really a disaster. Ryegrass is actually the worst of all grasses to put down, and it's what everybody tells you to do. This is how it just should be left to its own device, especially if it is a healthy, clean area to begin with, and nature recovers, right? This is, everybody was running off to the desert to see the wildflowers that spring, and this was Del Dios around Lake Hodges and Escondido after the Witch Creek fire. It was incredible, incredible wildflower displays, you know, just spontaneously reestablishment of the ecology without screwing it up. You know, even the landscapes came back to life, okay? The monkey flower and stuff. Again, I probably wouldn't be planting right under the eaves, but so be it now. Here's an example of a site that was seeded. It is destroyed. In one swoop, it is destroyed. And this is star thistle and grass. You have to throw away your socks every time you walk through it. It's going to degrade these oak trees in the background. It's just a disaster. This is how it should look. Very clean. From the heat, sometimes you'll even get glass silica that has melted and actually formed glass on there. And that's okay. That's just part of the natural process. And then a year later, it should look like this with all the wildflowers and stump sprouting that's reestablishing. And then 5 years later, here it is, totally restored back to its former self. And that's it. That's the end. Thank you very much. So I'm going to stop sharing. All right. And, you know, if there's some questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, Greg, so thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, very educational, and as always, so informative. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the questions in the chat. Someone asked, Eric Angel asked, what year was the 1970, 2001, 2003 photos taken?
Yeah, hi, Eric, by the way, thanks for attending. Yeah, I believe that photo was taken, Steve, yeah, around 2007, 2008. That was taken by Rick Halsey and was in his book, Chaparral Survival, Fire and Survival in Southern California, which I highly recommend. Okay.
All right. Next, Laura Hunter had a question about how did you remove the weeds? Were you pulling them or doing something different?
So that is a great question. Okay, and it was a multi-step process, and we try to minimize the use of any chemicals. Sometimes it's inevitable. Around the oak trees, they can typically be hand pulled. That oak leaf litter, if it's allowed to remain in place, is a wonderful mulch and makes it very easy to remove non-native exotic weeds. Some of the problems in these areas were grass related, so we actually used grass killer, like the oat grass and the ripgut brome. Sometimes we did use Roundup, but we didn't really use that much. We really minimized it. And also, you know, when we would do the thinning in that, we would put the mulch, grind up the chaparral, which is the best mulch there is, and put it right back down on the site, which would also help discourage a lot of weed growth in these now opened up areas. So it was actually, and we also used pre-emergence in some areas, which kill weed seed in the soil. That's really the most practical way. You know, these are that site in Ramona I showed you is 10 acres. You can't, there's not enough labor in Southern California to try to hand pull your way through 10 acres of weed infestation. It just doesn't work. Oh, I didn't mention cows. We use cows too. Turns out cows are some of the best weed eaters around. They'll actually target this non-native vegetation, much of which was originally brought in as cow pasture, and they evolved with it. And they'll actually often leave the natives alone. Cows are the best, actually. They're the most selective. I've had some fantastic looking sites that were actually being lightly grazed, and it's important to be lightly grazed by cattle, and then maybe we do some cross fencing and move them to the next paddock when they've eaten all the weeds, and they want to start on the natives, we'll move them to the next paddock.
That's funny, because when I was up at Tilden recently, they were using goats.
I'm not a goat person, guys. I'm sorry. Goat, sheep, that's what got us into this mess in the first place in a lot of cases on the hillsides and that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
all right.
No, goats are a problem, yeah, to me. I mean, I love them. They're cute as hell.
They're cute.
They can serve a purpose if it's nothing but weeds and you need to clear it, but they typically are not very selective.
Yeah. Okay, Eric had a question about oak duff and whether you recommend clearing it out during the fire season or leaving it year round.
And I think I mentioned this too, that I do leave it. We do recommend leaving it down. Even though it is a mulch that will burn somewhat, usually in the absence of weeds, the flame heights are such that they're easily tolerated by the oak trees. And what you gain is no weeds that can act as fire ladders, an excellent ecology, ectomycorrhizal ecology underneath those oak trees, which is sustaining the oak and providing hydration and health. And so a healthy oak tree, they don't burn. What happens with oak trees is if you remove the oak leaves, you let the weeds get underneath it, they burn and they allow for enough heat and flame height to actually boil the oak tree, and the oak trees explode.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, Jeffrey Bishop had a question. So are you saying we should deep water in the summer or only lightly hydrate up to the point where the mulch has some moisture, but not the soil root system below?
It's somewhere in the middle. So basically you're hydrating the mulch. Okay, and I showed you an example like 14 months later that was completely consolidated down, only an inch thick. Okay, so that absorbs a tremendous amount of moisture. And what that does is it creates vapor pressure, which helps maintain the slight bit of soil humidity you want for the mycorrhizal fungi. It'll also moisten the top layer of the soil, but we're not after saturation. You don't really want to do that. And mulch is a wonderful safety valve for that. It actually provides you a buffer in addition to all the biochemistry that it provides. If it's the right mulch, the shredded redwood bark being the best, along with shredded brown chaparral, which is pretty rare to come by.
So I know that there's a lot of, well, not really controversy, but people who do not water at all during the summertime. And then there are other people who will do a deep water every 3 weeks. And so with our drier winters, what is the recommendation for how often we should water in the summer?
Yeah, so there's some different approaches that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. The one thing in fire resistant wildland urban interfaces that I do not recommend, certainly within zone 2, okay, and inward, is not to water. That's a double negative. Water, but light water, okay? We're actually putting out less moisture than a 12-inch Netafim grid puts out, okay? But you're applying it in a way that emulates natural rainfall. And remember, you're watering all this biology, all this interconnecting biology with fungi in the soil. So you're watering the whole plant community you've created, okay? It's not about just supplying water to a single plant, okay? So you're trying to emulate nature in the best way you can. And what you're doing is you're providing a thunderstorm. And you're doing it 2 or 3 times a month. And the water usage is still far less than if you had a conventional planting of, say, ice plant or, say, rosemary, which needs much more water in order to achieve that level of somewhat fire-resistant hydration.
Yeah, I think people don't realize that Mediterranean plants actually require more water than California native plants. And
yeah, they do.
So there's a little confusion.
In our experience, observationally, about 2 to 3 times as much water. They're still more drought tolerant than conventional Raphiolepis and stuff in most situations, certainly lawn, but they're not as drought tolerant as native plants, which are adapted, but also remember, they're supported by this mycorrhizal fungal grid. That's a huge reservoir and providing moisture and storing it for them and moving it around to where it's needed in the plant community. So, all this stuff gets ignored by ornamental horticulture. And that's where we try to take it to the next level here. And so, I love these questions because it's an opportunity to kind of educate and inform.
All right, wonderful. Abby had a question on how steep of a slope can she realistically mulch?
1.5 to 1. Okay. So most modern construction, the limit is 1.5 to 1 on the cut slope. And you can mulch all the way up to 1.5 to 1. However, when you're putting the redwood down, it's only redwood that will stick. Any of the chip mulches have trouble even sticking to a 2-to-1 slope, okay? So when you put down this stuff, you need to wet it immediately. And as you put it down, you wet it, and it's like paper mache. It helps adhere it to the mulch, to the slope.
Oh, wonderful. We have a bunch of thank yous.
Thank you guys.
From Chiwa, Pamela, and Karen. Also Lisa Leondis. Greg Zhang has a question. Is it true that hardwood trees are less combustible than softwood trees?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. What I can tell you is that a well-hydrated tree is less combustible than a not so well-hydrated tree. Oaks have performed magnificently. I've seen them save homes time and time again. So has sycamore, so has cottonwood. In fact, sometimes you're in a situation where you only have maybe 20 feet of backyard, and then there's like a chaparral preserve right behind you. What do you do in that situation? Well, you know, maybe you get them to thin it properly, but they usually don't maintain it. It just becomes a weedy mess, and it's worse. So what I've done is I've planted oaks, sycamores, and cottonwoods right behind the house to act as something of a firewall and maintain hydration in those. I don't typically plant pine trees there, but your sycamores, oaks, you know, your kind of oak woodland, riparian forest type stuff does very well as sort of a firewall.
Okay, so someone had a question about if you are familiar with the Miyazaki method. He advocates dense planting of native trees and large plants and has had some amazing results.
Well, I'm not specifically familiar with it, but what you're describing there is very consistent with what we've seen. I saw a house in the Pines fire in Julian, and the guy was completely surrounded by Arctostaphylos fringlii, which is a type of upright manzanita that's very common up there. Beautiful manzanita. You see it all over Idlewild too. This stuff was actually touching the eaves, okay? And it came out about 10 feet. And any fire marshal would have had a heart attack, right? Here comes the Pines fire. And this stuff was all lightly hydrated. Here comes the Pines fire. It hits the stand of manzanita, hardly even singed a leaf, split, went around, burned down both of his neighbors, continued on, rejoined up, and went up the hill. Okay, and here he was standing with this massive stand of, you know, horribly flammable manzanita, but it was the only thing that was hydrated there, and it performed incredibly well. And I would have even, when I saw it, I was a little concerned. It was only 3 or 4 months later that it burned, and here we are.
All right. Cynthia has a question. Can you recommend a really tough, easy native for hot, dry, exposed slopes without a lot of water? Need something easy and tough to get started and replace the ice plant.
So Backer's Pigeon Point is one of the best. If it is southern exposure, you're probably wanting to water it every 7 to 10 days. It comes from Pigeon Point, California, and as do many of our evergreen ground covers come from central north coast, where they've adapted to growing low because they're exposed to constant salt spray and sea wind. Okay. The only issue you have in Southern California is it's hot and the soil is hot, and you want to put a good mulch down, but you probably need to water just a little bit more to maintain that hydration. I've had wonderful success in these hot exposed locations with ground cover forms of flat top buckwheat. And that's one that you could easily get away with watering 2 to 3 times a month and maintaining a nice level of hydration. I've showed you how buckwheat behaves when it gets lightly hydrated, right? I mean, some of the worst, what we think of as fire bombs, actually benefit the most from the light supplemental hydration, okay? Now, I can't guarantee a home won't burn in a firestorm, right? It may have nothing to do with the landscape, okay? But so far, you know, knock wood, it's worked out. It's worked out well, and we have some science behind it. So yeah, I think some of the ground cover like Bruce Dickinson or Theodore Payne or Dana Point make nice, very soil stabilizing ground covers. You can mix that with Bacchus Pigeon Point. If you're inland, maybe Ceanothus Joyce Coulter is about the most heat tolerant of the ground cover. Ceanothus, much more so than Yankee Point.
All righty. Let's see here.
By the way, that picture of that house in Ramona that had the big deck at the back, that's in Ramona, okay? And that is Bacchus on the slope, the Pigeon Point, and there's some coffeeberry on there, there's some toyon lower down, and there's some ground cover manzanitas, I think Franciscana, that's a good one for that situation. It was getting watered about twice a month, you know, so it did fine.
Funny questions. Someone has a question, Karen Glass, Glass has a question about succulents, including cacti near the house.
Well, you know, succulents are interesting. Many of them are not nearly as drought tolerant as we think they are. A lot of times our woody xerophytic shrubs can do better than succulents. Having said that, though, as long as the succulents are low growing, I think we're going to find that they'll allow them to grow in that zone 0. And you want to use, in general with succulents, you don't want to use organic mulches. You want to use sand, rocks, gravel, you know, pebbles. So that also helps with the fire. So I think in general, you're probably okay with some succulents.
Sukyo has a question about clarifying, does zone 2 for hillside properties extend 150 to 200 feet along the slope?
No, usually it's a horizontal displacement. And the slope is the hypotenuse of the triangle. So it's going to be a longer length. Okay,
perfect. George has a question about the thickness of mulch, 1 inch. What's the theory?
We usually put it down 3 to 4 inches thick. Then the overhead watering rather rapidly consolidates down to less than an inch thick. This is shredded redwood bark, what I'm talking about, which is very fibrous. It's a very different mulch than any of the chip mulches.
Mm-hmm.
They call it gorilla hair.
Right. You know, when our landscape was installed 4 years ago, maybe 5 now, when I was doing some gardening and I happened to turn the mulch over, I noticed this whole network of fungus. And I thought, oh my God, this looks terrible.
Yeah.
And then I think Greg said, no, that's what it's supposed to look like.
Part of the ecology.
The other fun thing is when the mulch first went down, I had surprisingly morel mushrooms growing.
Morels, you got morels.
Yes, I did.
I want to share that with people. We're seeing that with the gorilla hair, okay? So this gorilla hair comes from the redwood forest. A lot of the time, it's full of spore. So I've got morels, chanterelles, truffles showing up in these landscapes, guys. These are all ectomycorrhizal fruiting bodies. It's part of the ecology. It's amazing. Natives are so cool.
They are. They're my new passion. Not new, but it's been ever since you put in my garden, Greg. So.
I'm glad you like it.
So someone had a question about how long does shredded redwood mulch last?
5 to 10 years.
Yeah, a good long time.
Long time. That low rate of decomposition is one of the key aspects that promotes this ecology, because the other mulches, the dump mulches are the worst. Grass mulch is even worse. They break down so quickly that they load the soil up with organic matter. They promote bacterial, anaerobic bacterial processes and not the aerobic fungal-based processes that we're looking after with our soil. So yeah, the redwood's really important, and I'm just horrified by this trend up north. They're banning it. And that's, a lot of times they're basing it on tests as cedar mulch, which is very different than redwood mulch, but also it's not consolidated, okay? And what's frustrating is nobody's giving me a call, so I can show them, okay, you wanna see how the mulch actually performed in fires, guys? All these landscapes are mulched, and there's some scorch marks. I've got other ones with scorch marks on rocks too. You can see it's about a 2-inch flame height, okay? So if we lose this mulch, I mean, it's, I don't know, man.
I know, it's worked so wonderfully. We've used it in our public garden at Bird Park, our adopt a plot, and it has done such a fabulous job with maintaining a certain degree of moisture in the soil. We're only watering every 10 days for 30 minutes, and this is brand new native landscaping. And it's just doing such a wonderful job. So I really like it a lot. So anyways, I wanted to let everyone know that we are getting to the end of our talk here. This presentation has been recorded. It will be posted next week to the CNPS-San Diego YouTube channel, where we have lots of other fun, informative videos available for you to peruse. And I just want to thank Greg so much for taking the time to do this very important, timely talk about fire reduction and prevention. Excuse my kitty. And we've had just a great time with you, Greg. And so everyone, if you want to say, give Greg a thumbs up in the reaction box, just click on that, or applause. And I think we're at the end of our questions. So again, great presentation, Greg, and we will let you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Well, thank you guys. It was a real honor to speak to you. I'll be giving this presentation actually Walter Anderson's on Saturday morning. So hopefully we'll have some landscape contractors show up for that too. And thank you for all your support, and really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
All right.